Dzień dobry, witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie w Międzynarodowym Centrum Kultury na wydarzeniu, które jest współorganizowane przez 3 instytucje: Europejską Sieć Pamięć i Solidarność i Muzeum Narodowe w Krakowie, no i MCK. Bardzo się cieszę, że Państwo w piątkowe piękne popołudnie przyszli na wykład wyjątkowy. Naszym gościem dzisiaj jest pan profesor Jay Winter, który po słowach wstępnych, o których zaraz usłyszymy, wygłosi wykład pod tytułem Modernism and the Persistence of Tradition. Modernizm a ciągłość tradycji. I zanim oddam głos współgospodarzowi tego wydarzenia, panu dyrektorowi Rafałowi Rogulskiemu z Europejskiej Sieci Pamięć i Solidarność, dodam tylko, że ten wykład towarzyszy wspaniałej wystawie prezentowanej jeszcze tylko do końca tego tygodnia, do niedzieli w Muzeum Narodowym w Krakowie. Nowy początek, modernizm w drugiej RP. Bardzo, bardzo zachęcam Państwa do zobaczenia tej wystawy, ale też do innej podróżującej wystawy poświęconej pamięci I wojny, którą to wystawę przygotowało i wyprodukowała właśnie Europejska Sieć Pamięć i Solidarność. Tytuł Po Wielkiej Wojnie, Nowa Europa 1918-1923. A teraz już zapraszam pana dyrektora Rafała Rogulskiego, aby objął tutaj rząd dusz, a po wstępie jeszcze może zapowiem, że jeszcze głos oprócz naszego gościa zabierze pan profesor Piotr Juszkiewicz z Poznania. Zapraszam.
Dobry wieczór Państwu. Bardzo dziękuję Pani Dyrektor. Od obejmowania rządu dusz to będzie tutaj pan profesor Jay Winter, a wcześniej pan profesor Juszkiewicz, ale przy okazji tego typu przedsięwzięć zawsze jest też ważnym momentem, by podziękować wszystkim tym, którzy się przyczynili do tego, żebyśmy się mogli dzisiaj spotkać. Dlatego bardzo serdecznie dziękuję pani dyrektor Agacie Wąsowskiej-Pawlik i Międzynarodowemu Centrum Kultury, wszystkim współpracownikom, którzy byli zaangażowani w to przedsięwzięcie. Podobnie jak współpracownikom i panu dyrektorowi, profesorowi Andrzejowi Szczerskiemu i Muzeum Narodowemu. No i oczywiście współpracownikom Europejskiej Sieci Pamięć i Solidarność. Proszę wybaczyć, nie wymienię tych kilkunastu osób, które były zaangażowane w to przedsięwzięcie, ale bardzo wszystkim dziękuję. Chcę też bardzo serdecznie podziękować panu profesorowi Winterowi. Zwykle nie odkrywa się kuchni organizacyjnej, ale przyznam się Państwu, że mail do pana profesora z propozycją tego wykładu napisałem na początku marca. Napisałem go wieczorem przed wyjściem z biura. Kiedy dojechałem do domu, już była odpowiedź, że przyjedzie do Krakowa. No i wtedy zaczęliśmy pracę. To jest dość niezwykła sytuacja, ale przede wszystkim to jest niezwykły mówca. Bowiem pan profesor Jay Winter to jest jeden z najwybitniejszych znawców, jeden z najwybitniejszych żyjących historyków i znawców I wojny światowej. Amerykański historyk, związany od wielu, wielu lat z Uniwersytetem w Yale. Współautor kilkudziesięciu książek, w tym The Great War and the British People, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, The Great War in European Culture History, a także autor czy współautor i współproducent nagrodzonej nagrodą Emmy serii telewizyjnej The Great War and the Shaping of the 20th Century, emitowanej już wiele lat temu przez BBC. To był niezwykły sukces i też wspaniały sposób na to, żeby poszerzać wiedzę na temat I wojny światowej i jej wpływu na nas i na nasz wiek. Zanim wypowie się pan profesor Jay Winter, to rozpocznie tę intelektualną ucztę pan profesor Piotr Juszkiewicz. Obaj panowie spotkali się, tworząc wystawę, o której pani dyrektor już zechciała powiedzieć, wystawę Po Wielkiej Wojnie, opowiadającej o pierwszych latach po I wojnie światowej, zupełnie inne przedsięwzięcie wystawiennicze niż to, któremu towarzyszy ten wykład. Przedsięwzięcie, które jeździ po świecie i którego celem jest pokazanie podstawowych, najważniejszych procesów, które wtedy miały miejsce i które współkształtują naszą rzeczywistość do dziś. Zaczniemy od pokazania 5-minutowego filmu, w którym właśnie pan profesor Winter opowiada o tej wystawie i oprowadza po niej, tak żeby dać państwu krótki obraz tego, co jest na tej wystawie i po co ją zrobiliśmy. A film był kręcony w Verdun, podczas prezentacji w Verdun. I tam będziecie państwo mogli zobaczyć również krótkie urywki z tego miasta, trochę łączące wystawę Nowy Początek, modernizm polski z modernizmem, który powstawał na świecie w różnych innych miejscach, w tym we Francji. Proszę pozwolić, że oddam w tej chwili głos panu profesorowi Piotrowi Juszkiewiczowi. Pan profesor Juszkiewicz jest profesorem historii sztuki na Uniwersytecie Adama Mickiewicza w Poznaniu, kierownikiem Zakładu Historii i Teorii Badań nad Sztuką, ekspertem w dziedzinie sztuki XX wieku i krytyki artystycznej, autorem licznych publikacji, wśród nich Od rozkoszy historiozofii do gry w nic, Cień modernizmu, czy wydane wspólnie z Europejską Siecią Pamięć i Solidarność Image, History and Memory, Central and Eastern Europe in Comparative Perspective, zredagowane wspólnie z panem profesorem Michałem Hake. Koniec, już nie będę więcej mówił. W tej chwili zapraszam państwa na krótki film, a potem poproszę pana profesora Juszkiewicza o wstęp. Dziękuję bardzo, że państwo przyszli.
I'm very happy to introduce this exhibition on the new Europe, 1918 to 1923. It was a time very much like our own, filled with innovation and instability. It is a moment that reminds us where we came from 100 years ago to create a Europe that is still on the way to being realized. These images show the mix of violence and new vistas of life that were opened in 1918. Some countries found peace in 1918, others still remained in war. Some countries gained their independence, some countries lost it. What we can see at the photograph on the bottom is burning buildings in the civil war in Finland, which directly followed the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and produced the worst civil war in Finland's memory. It involved civilian casualties of a kind that were unusual for the First World War, but became characteristic for the years 1918 to 23 that followed. The years after the First World War were among the most unstable in all of European history. Here we see an image of children building castles with money that was worthless. If you came to an opera in 1923, by the time you got to the second act, the price of your ticket had gone up by 100%. The value of money was destroyed by the war and the hyperinflation that followed it. Those who worry about economic stability should look at 1918 to 23 to see what it really looked like. The years after 1918 were years of innovation, years of new roles for women, many of whom got the vote as a result of the war. New industries, new forms of communication, transformation. The innovations that took place in the 1920s are less well known than the violence, but nonetheless the innovations have lasted longer. This is a description of the peace treaty that settled the war between the Allies and Austria Austria didn't exist in 1914, and it was treated very harshly in the treaty that followed it. And it is remembered as one of the moments when the country declined from the status of an enormous empire to that of a small country. This exhibition reflects a recovery of a memory that once was strong and now has faded away. It's time to restore it because the memory of Eastern Europe is part of the European history, which is the basis of the European Union. No history, no union. This recovery of memory is a recovery of political stability. Here at Verdun, we stand in an alley of remembrance with a medieval knight looking over the town, which gave birth to 20th century warfare, as if modern language was incapable of expressing the immense enormity of what took place here, and they went back to the medieval times to make sense of what war was. This is the violent beginning of the new Europe that the exhibition explores for us.
Dzień dobry, a właściwie dobry wieczór Państwu. Ja naturalnie przyłączam się do tych wszystkich podziękowań, które pojawiły się tutaj już wcześniej za to, że mamy okazję uczestniczyć w tak wspaniałym wydarzeniu, jak to wydarzenie dzisiejsze. I szczególnie jestem wdzięczny za to, że kilka słów bardzo króciutkiego wstępu, a właściwie drugiej części tego wstępu mam okazję wygłosić przed wykładem naszego znakomitego gościa, czyli pana profesora Jaya Wintera. Ale jestem wdzięczny też, proszę Państwa, za to, że zostałem zaproszony do współpracy nad tą wystawą outdoorową, o której film przed chwilą Państwo widzieli, za co dziękuję. Tutaj osobiście chcę skierować podziękowania do pana dyrektora Rafała Rogulskiego, że do tego grona znakomitych historyków światowej sławy zaprosił skromnego historyka sztuki, który te swoje 3 grosze tam do całej tej wystawy dorzucił. I jestem ogromnie wdzięczny panu dyrektorowi Andrzejowi Szczerskiemu, że zaprosił mnie do współpracy nad tą wystawą, która właśnie jeszcze trwa w Muzeum Narodowym w Krakowie. Wystawy, za pomocą której chcieliśmy powiedzieć i pokazać kilka w naszym przekonaniu ważnych kwestii związanych z nowoczesnością, związanych z modernizacją i związanych z narodzinami II RP. Gdybym miał króciutko powiedzieć, proszę Państwa, jakie momenty łączą te dwie wystawy, to powiedziałbym, że 3 kluczowe terminy. Wojna, modernizm, tutaj modernizacja i nowoczesność i pamięć. Myślę, że te 3 momenty łączą tę wystawę i są niesłychanie ważne. Jeśli idzie o wojnę, to oczywiście ta pierwsza wystawa przede wszystkim o niej traktuje o niebywałych zupełnie skutkach, jeśli idzie o kształt Europy, trwających oczywiście do dzisiaj. Na naszej wystawie w muzeum tak wiele uwagi wojnie nie poświęcamy, ale jej cień jest tam niesłychanie mocno obecny. Jest obecny dlatego, ponieważ widać przez niektóre prace pamięć o wojnie, która Polsce przyniosła niepodległość, ale która za sobą pociągnęła cały szereg rozmaitych skutków. Wspomnę tylko skromny obraz Rafała Malczewskiego, który przedstawia inwalidę wojennego i on prawie na wejściu naszej wystawy się pojawia. Wojna oczywiście w Polsce niepodległej wówczas odbierana była inaczej, przede wszystkim jako szansa odzyskania własnej państwowości, własnego miejsca w świecie, w Europie, nadania nowemu państwu nowej tożsamości. I w dużej części nasza wystawa jest temu poświęcona, mianowicie właśnie kwestii narodzin II RP, nowego, odrodzonego państwa polskiego. Więc oczywiście pierwsza wojna jest tam niesłychanie w sposób istotny obecna. Ten drugi termin, czyli modernizm, proszę Państwa, to termin, za pomocą którego chcieliśmy opisać to, co wydarza się w tym powojennym świecie, a mianowicie chcieliśmy opisać fakt zaistnienia właściwie szerokiego i bardzo różnorodnego frontu tych ludzi, którzy chcieli zbudować nowy świat po wojnie, którzy chcieli właśnie zbudować nową rzeczywistość. Stawiali tej minionej rzeczywistości bardzo precyzyjne i bardzo ostre diagnozy, i to zarówno w sferze polityki, gospodarki, życia społecznego, jak i sztuki, i właśnie próbowali wybudować nową rzeczywistość. Jakkolwiek by to nie brzmiało paradoksalnie, to chcieliśmy powiedzieć za pomocą tej wystawy, że modernizm niesłychanie wiele zawdzięcza przeszłości, spojrzeniu w przeszłość po to, żeby wybudować nową przyszłość. I wreszcie pamięć, proszę Państwa, obie wystawy oczywiście są także formułami pamięci, obie o pamięci traktują. Ta nasza wystawa w Muzeum Narodowym w Krakowie posługuje się szczególną formą pamięci, dziełami sztuki. Staraliśmy się operować za pomocą dzieł sztuki, żeby pokazać, jak te procesy modernizacyjne zostały zapamiętane, czy zostały utrwalone przez artystyczną działalność. Ale ponieważ modernizm był niesłychanie heterogeniczny, niesłychanie różnorodny, to staraliśmy się opisać go nie tylko za pomocą dzieł sztuki, ale za pomocą tego wszystkiego, co zmieniało ówczesną rzeczywistość. Tak jak pan profesor Winter mówił w tym filmie, który oglądaliśmy przed chwilą, mamy do czynienia z kwestiami związanymi z postępem technologicznym, ze zmianami w dziedzinie komunikacji, transportu i wielu jeszcze innych aspektów, które spowodowały, że ta nowa powojenna Europa zyskała szczególny kształt. Proszę Państwa, w obu wystawach jako współpracownik brałem udział. Być może nie wypada mi w ten sposób ich chwalić, ale to znakomite wystawy. Proszę Państwa, ta wystawa outdoorowa, która rzeczywiście objechała pół Europy, zrobiła wielkie wrażenie. Myślę, że w niezwykły, taki sumaryczny sposób wiele niesłychanie istotnych rzeczy pokazała i zachęcam Państwa do tego, żeby zajrzeć jeszcze do Muzeum Narodowego w Krakowie i popatrzeć na tę wizję modernizmu, którą żeśmy z panem profesorem Szczerskim dla Państwa skonstruowali i staramy się ją pokazać. Serdecznie dziękuję za uwagę. Dziękuję serdecznie.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jay Winter. I'm an historian, and I've been this afternoon deeply impressed by the exhibition closing on Sunday that provided, I think, a moment of reflection of a kind that I want to share with you today. And it's a form of a comment on a love affair I have with this painting. This is a painting of the Swiss-German artist Paul Klee called The Angel of History. And it's a painting that had, I think, great, and still does have a great deal of resonance for art historians, for those who study philosophy, and those who think about the trajectory of European history over the last century. And I do want to say that these remarks are meant as a form of commentary on an extraordinary exhibition in the National Museum. I think what it shows is that the construction of freedom was the catalyst for a burst of creativity that had been, I think, in embryo before, but didn't have the conditions of full expression until the Polish Republic became a reality. Perhaps, if we're lucky, we'll see the same after Putin's brutal war comes to the end in Ukraine. And I want to refer back to that moment because the period of the exhibition, the period when Paul Klee painted this angel of history, is one that I think Putin has returned to in his criminal war in Ukraine. Not to 1945, not to 1989, but to 1919, 1920 years of brutality against civilians. And it is that war, in part, that Paul Klee put in the eyes and mind of the angel of history. Now, I'm not the first to draw these lessons out of that painting. The first person, I think, who did so was someone who bought this painting from Paul Klee. He was a German philosopher named Walter Benjamin. And Benjamin, who later became a refugee in France and who committed suicide when he went to the Spanish border and found that he couldn't get through. In fact, the next day he probably could, but his decision to take his own life was because he feared being returned to Germany in 1940. But before he went to the Spanish border, he gave this painting to a friend, Gershom Scholem, who's a historian, philosopher, and that person had it for many, many years until it became the object of an enormous lawsuit. It took 15 years to decide who it belonged to. And finally, the legal answer was it belonged to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, where it is to this day. Now, here is Benjamin looking at the painting that you can see in front of you. And these are his words, because I think those words that you can see on the screen, I hope you can read them, address an issue crucial to our understanding of modernism. That is to say, its multiform character, its embrace of a series of contradictions between modernity and tradition, between the old and the new. One way, I think, to understand modernism is the seizure of the old and wresting to new uses of traditional forms of expression so that they become new again. We all make the world out of that in which we are born. We can't create ex nihilo. So to a degree, the traditional is part of the modern. It's how it's configured, which I think gives it its extraordinary vitality. And modernism is the attempt to wrestle to new uses, older forms. This is the way Benjamin wrote about it in his 9th thesis on the philosophy of history. You have to remember this what you see here was never published in his lifetime. It was among a group of writings that he put together between 1937 during the great international exhibition on the arts and métier of modern life, and gave to a friend, Georges Bataille, who then gave it to a great German scholar, refugee herself, Hannah Arendt, who published them. So these are as it were, the fragments of a man who took his own life because of his impossibility of living with the contradictions between violence and modernity. Benjamin said this: a clay painting named Angelus Novus, which is what you see, shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring. His mouth is open. This is an angel. His wings are spread. He can't close them. This is how one pictures, Benjamin says, the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. Think of this, in 1937 and 1939, just before Benjamin took his own life. The angel would like to stay, to awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close his wings. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned. He doesn't look toward the future, but toward the past, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm, propelling the angel of history forward, is what we call progress. That word had a taste as of ashes attached to it. Benjamin, in the same, this is the seventh thesis of the philosophy of history written at the same time, said, there is no monument to civilization, let's call it, to the creativity of the human race, which is not at the same time a monument to barbarism. This vision of the angel of history staring at the past while watching the debris from destruction pile up, perhaps to even obliterate his face, is an image I have lived with for many years and want to draw to your attention to it as a way of appreciating, indeed, the immense and powerful forces that are captured extraordinarily well in the exhibition at the National Museum on modernism. It's rare that an exhibition of that kind has a unity of interpretation and a brilliance of display that I urge you to see for yourselves. Now, what I want to do is to say that this dialectical, this dialogical, this contradictory feature of modernism makes us question the assertion I made at the very beginning, which is that the appearance of freedom, that the birth of the Polish Republic was the catalyst that created the field of force out of which so much innovation, so many dreams were realized. I want to suggest that there is a problem about the birth of the Polish Republic, which is that it's a discontinuity at a moment when there were other continuities still visible. On one occasion, when I spoke about this painting in Lviv, I did so at a time when I was taken by the historian of the city to see part of the landscape of violence in 1918 to 21 in that city, where 7 days after the armistice of the 11th of November 1918, on the 18th of November 1918, a pogrom broke out organized by Polish soldiers against the Jewish population of Lviv, then Lvov, before Lemberg, the same city. It was the first pogrom in the city in the entire period of the First World War. And it happened during the birth of Polish independence. Now, the violent years that followed 1918 are a continuation of something that happened before the birth of the Polish Republic. And it is therefore necessary for us to realize, as the exhibition on the period immediately after the Great War shows, that there is as I think we can see in the words of Benjamin and the image of Paul Klee, there is a terrible moment when the Polish Republic was born, when a certain kind of violence took over and became a characteristic of the way in which war is waged. And that primary characteristic is war waged against civilians, like the Jews of Lvov. This was a very important point to realize, because Vladimir Putin has gone back to 1919. He has recreated and justified, without any basis whatsoever, a war in which the bombardment of maternity homes, of schools, of orphanages, of civilian life in its simplest form is part and parcel of military action. That is what happened between 1918 and 1921, and the shadow of that violence did not lift between the two world wars. So in a way, what modernism had to live with was not only freedom, but violence of a kind which had been radically, I think, altered over the previous 20 years. The first genocide of the 20th century happened in Turkey, in Ottoman Turkey. It was inflicted on the Armenian population, but everyone was watching. It wasn't something that was done in the dark. It was a precedent for worse violence to come. And this is the terrible, as it were, burden of we historians who write about modernism have to bear, which is, it is the story, as Benjamin put it, of extraordinary monuments to civilization, which are at the same time and at the same moment monuments to barbarism. So I do believe that Benjamin's angel of history floated into the field of modernity with his gaze fixed firmly on the past. Once again, his back, if you remember, was turned on us, those who came after him. The onward march toward modernism was not his concern. Instead, his eyes were directed towards the wreckage, the violence of the period that extended beyond the birth of the Polish Republic, from 1918 to 1921 to 1923, and then in the course of the 1930s came to haunt the rest of Europe and the world. It is, in many respects, what I think I want to give you one message, is that the apocalypse, very well described in the exhibition, the feeling of the decline of the West and the breakdown of civilized standards, that the decline of the West was embedded in the modernist project. So it's my central contention that modernism, the direct subject of the exhibition, was a dialectical movement, moving irresistibly toward the future while pointing fixedly toward the past. The backward gaze of so many writers, artists, politicians, soldiers, and everyday families in this period reflected tensions within the modernist project that are still with us. But among the most salient of that moment in time, and again, Putin has brought this back to us in a way that I certainly did not know when we made that film. This film was made before the war in Ukraine. When I said the violence hasn't lasted, the creativity has, I think I've said something which I'd like to correct. Unfortunately, violence has a habit of sneaking up behind all modernist projects and destroying them if they can, inflecting them always. Among the most salient features of modernism, and indeed of creative thought in many different fields in the period of the Great War, was the fact that the war introduced the phenomenon of mass death. The war and its sequel were a paroxysm of the modern, a vast assembly line of death that consumed over 10 million people between 1914 and 1918, and an equal number of men and women in the 5 years that followed it. Those wars were modern in a way we now know viscerally and visually in a new way. They were wars targeting civilians, just like Putin's monstrous war in Ukraine today. Given the lethality of the modernism of warfare, it is hardly surprising that modernism has this, as I put it, taste as of ashes associated with it. Modernism developed its visions and dreams in a particularly haunted moment of world history. I speak specifically of the shadow of the dead, of the violent upheavals of the years 1914 to 1923, and of the failed peace that unraveled in the subsequent 2 decades. My own family was Polish, although as Jews in Warsaw, they didn't see themselves that way. And in a way, all of my work over 50 years in this subject has been a way of circling around the disaster of the Second World War by looking at its antechamber, by looking and studying that catastrophe that made it thinkable, that made it possible, that made it imaginable. Now, the interplay between clearing away the rubble of war, civil war, revolution, and counter-revolution on the one hand, and that enormous and creative force moving towards a forward-looking future based on machines made to serve men and women and not to destroy them is what the exhibition shows. It's that creative tension between the two dimensions of modernity. This dialectic was indeed evident in the outdoor exhibition developed by the European Network of Remembrance and Solidarity on after the Great War. And again, I've been privileged to be one of the members of this international community of scholars that created that. I hadn't seen the film or heard my own words until I came to this meeting today. I think I agree with almost everything I said. Now, I think the important point is that this enterprise is actually part of a much broader phenomenon. It's what I call the imbrication of scholarship in public history. Now, public history means history taken out of the university, out of the academy, and spoken in language that anyone can understand, so that citizenship becomes part of scholarship, and scholarship becomes part of the citizen's world. And once again, I salute the exhibition for doing that and its extraordinary catalog. It's a very remarkable catalog to read and to treasure. So I want to tell you something about the public history of this moment when modernism was dragged, I would say, into the field of force between creativity and destruction. I want to suggest that almost everybody, not everyone, but almost everyone who worked in the arts knew the fact that violence is the hidden and sometimes not so hidden face of modernism. There's a very interesting set of images about a certain kind of movement, of force. The force is aggressive, or the force can be beautiful in a pirouette of peace. But there are elements in the exhibition that seem to me to be completely au fait with this dialectic between the destructive and the constructive sides of modernism. And not only here, the Italian futurists knew this, and so did the Russian constructivists. In fact, if we talked about modernism in Russia, we would have to talk about violence. There's no doubt about it. The cinema captured the violence of the Russian Revolution in Eisenstein's hands in such a way that the regime decided to take his fictional story and narrative and replace it for the reality, which was much more banal than that. There's something about violence that gave modernists their opportunity to go beyond it. The question at the heart of modernism is, how can the tools of the new be wrested away from the forces of destruction? By the way, I think it's a question we have to ask about the internet. We have to ask about artificial intelligence. This is not an issue that has gone away. But in the period that we're referring to, the interwar years, the period of the Second Polish Republic, the question is slightly different. It's how could the future be built without producing a mountain of corpses obscuring the sky and disfiguring the new and the old alike, in the language of Walter Benjamin. The answers they formulated were brave, hopeful, striking. But ultimately, the new wave of creativity that emerged after the First World War was blocked and then tragically smashed by the violent modernism of the Nazi and Soviet armies and their collaborators and supporters all over Europe. When we step back and confront the dilemmas faced by the generation that founded the Second Polish Republic and the New World Order of 1918 and after, we may conclude that there was no peaceful way out of their dilemmas, that they were tragically trapped in this dialectic. Violence and modernism were braided together inextricably. And maybe Putin has shown that it still is. Indeed, Hannah Arendt was right in another way. She's the one who published the theses on the philosophy of history of Walter Benjamin. She said that the nation state failed to promote a liberal world order because a state is a place where the law protects everyone equally. A nation state protects some more than others and identifies minorities as not worth the protection of the law. This is what happened to her, born in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, or Kalinin, moving towards Germany and afterwards towards France and finally towards the United States. The nation state, including the Polish nation state, was a field for the maltreatment of minorities. I won't get into the story, I don't know enough about it to speak intelligently about anti-Semitism in interwar Poland, but it must be faced as a reality. I think instead of a state as an egalitarian exercise, in its place, the great killer empire sent the world into an even worse spiral of violence in 1939, 45, and beyond. So in the brief space given to me today, I would like to explore briefly, and in the terms and language, the visual language of the exhibition, this dialectical relationship between violence and modernism. But I'd like to argue that the shadow of the Great War wasn't only one shadow, but probably two. There was a bit of light between them, maybe, or perhaps it was divided in other ways. There was one part of the Great War and its aftermath, including the birth of the Polish Republic, that pointed towards the future. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today, in this particular building, in this particular room. And another part that pointed toward the past. The search for the new and unbounded was certainly at the core of artistic creativity after 1918. The new man, the search for the new man, new ways of living, new ways of being, new ways of inhabiting the earth together. That is certainly true. And the current exhibition on modernism in the National Museum does it justice in ways much better than I can. But I want to point to a part of the exhibition that shows that there was an equal and opposite vector in modernism, moving towards the past and the persistence of tradition, wrested to new usages. Why tradition rather than the unknown? Why does modernism have this hidden dialectic within it? Well, why do they have, as it were, a notion of going back rather than searching for the never-before-seen, the just-born? Those are essential parts of modernism, but they're not the only parts. And I want to suggest there's an answer for it. Throughout Europe and beyond Europe, all over the world, one reason, not the only, but one reason for the turn to classical, romantic, and religious tropes in the very varied fields of creative activity that the exhibition surveys. One reason all over the world for the return to the traditional is that these tropes were born again in the human disaster of the Great War and its aftermath. And why were they born again? Why was the traditional more powerful than it was in the past? Because remembering the dead, 10 million dead, much greater than any previous war over such a short period of time. Remembering the dead made us construct something called the lost generation, an entire generation of young men who didn't have the chance to grow old, who didn't have the chance to live lives that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. In many respects, I suggest that modernism moved away from the ubiquity of grief, which is a sentiment, away from bereavement, which is a condition, and away from mourning, which is a process of troubled and painful remembrance. I did, and I was very happy to see the artistic work of a mutilated soldier, but the dead are there in between the paintings, in between the, as it were, creative and exciting experiments in the future. Now, one difficult fact I think I'd like to suggest to you, indeed in exactly this form, a suggestion. It's something I could never prove, but I feel it in my bones. Modernism is exciting, extraordinary, in a way life-affirming. But modernism doesn't heal. It excites, it moves, it inspires, but it does not present a language of loss. Given the universality of grief and mourning, not only in Europe, but all over the world from 1914 on, and let's not forget that in its immediate aftermath, there was a pandemic that took many more lives than the war, perhaps greater even than the COVID pandemic that we've been through. But together, and that pandemic in 1918-19 attacked young adults in uniform or not. Given the fact that grief and mourning was ubiquitous, it is hardly surprising that a complex traditional vocabulary of mourning derived from classical, romantic, or religious forms flourished in these years, largely because they helped mediate bereavement. They spoke to families, they spoke to mothers, they spoke to fathers, they spoke to sons and daughters of those who weren't there anymore. That is, in my view, one reason why so many commemorative sites of memory fashioned in this period, like Benjamin's Angelus Novus, face the past and not the future. Well, in all societies, we all need a language to mourn. Symbols are retrieved from the past and inserted in rituals or icons or works of art in order to help people mourn. These symbols framed contemporary searches for some vestiges of meaning in the violence of the contemporary world and in the appalling suffering and losses that it brought about. I think there is abundant evidence as to how that search for meaning was conducted and in what forms it was expressed. Part of it had a political dimension. One meaning of the war, as I said from the beginning, was the rebirth of a free Poland. Scholars in many countries have shown how artists and architects sought a national vernacular to give to commemorative forms a particular national style or configuration, and that was inevitable. Where else are they going to turn except to their own vocabulary? But part of the search for meaning in the aftermath of the Great War goes beyond the local, the regional, and the national domain. There was then, and is now, a universal problem of grief and its social expression all these artists and the people for whom they worked knew about. However powerful the aesthetic or political message available to those in mourning, there was another level on which they lived the meaning of the war. That level was private, sometimes solitary, frequently hidden from view, but no one could doubt that it was there. States try to contain or control the language of collective grief. But in my view, states don't remember. People do, usually in groups, sometimes alone. It's only a metaphor to say that the state has a memory. Only human beings do. And I think that private level is the one that we must put alongside the political level. It's not that the political doesn't exist, it's just not always there. And in the private, people faced questions that involved timeless issues about the truncation of millions of lives, about promises unfulfilled, about the evanescence of hope, about there being a wasteland in T.S. Eliot's poem, which is as much a modernist account of this period as anything in the exhibition. Now, anyone approaching the cultural history of modernism who misses this third level, the level of the private, leaves out what sadly was at the heart of the experience of millions of people. Their families were imprinted with the wrenching experience of loss, the meaning of which was sought at least as much in the existential as in the artistic or political spheres. It is true that the Great War introduced political issues to every dimension of social life, and Hitler and Stalin made it necessary that that should be the case. But there were some issues that were both political and more than political. The experience of mass bereavement was one such issue. Now, human reactions to war are infinitely complicated and delicately coded, and I'm trying to present you one interpretation, not the only one. Grief, I believe, as I said, is a state of mind, bereavement a condition, and both are mediated by mourning, a set of acts and gestures through which survivors express grief and pass through stages of bereavement. That process of separation from the dead, of forgetting as much as remembering, is a hidden part of the complex history of modernism and all the creative expressions of the period whose visions are central to this fine exhibition. Now, there are three ways, I think, in which this human catastrophe was encoded. The first was visually, through images of the dead and sometimes of their return. There's a very interesting section on theosophy, which included a tendency for people to believe in the possibility of communication with the dead. It is surprising how widespread such views were. Some of them drew from Eastern religions rather than from Western religions. But the notion of speaking to those who are gone is one, I think, that we can understand, introduced people who were a part of the artistic avant-garde to a set of choices which, to a degree, have never gone away. The second manner, after the visual, was in prose and poetry, evidencing the same tendency to see the dead among the living. And here, too, sacred icons and images proliferated. Sacred language and the visual arts were not rejected. They were reconfigured, and I'm going to try to show you some examples of that in the exhibition in the National Museum. The powerful current of spiritualism in wartime testified to the same search for the sacred, albeit in unconventional forms. Now, the third form of cultural encoding was social. That is to say, it was expressed through social action, doing something, not just seeing something or creating a work of art. This was organized usually on the local level, in many countries through the grand ceremonies of Armistice Day, registering the same impulse. Most, but not all of these measures were small scale, with the human dimensions of Clay's Angelus Novus, one figure at a time, if you will, one angel at a time. They offered mutual assistance, support, and commemorative sites, and interestingly enough, in almost everywhere I've been able to do research, these rituals put women in the center of the narrative of war and peace. They are essential to the story of mourning, as they have always been. And that's part of the reason why these local events are frequently, when you can see the photography of them, places where women come into the story in visual and visceral ways. They gather in forms of religious worship, in widows' organizations, in commemorative meetings in schools, in reunions of comrades in arms, at the unveiling of local war memorials, and finally at the ceremonies conducted on behalf of the imagined community of the nation itself. Here the distinction between and among the political and the existential fades away, for the question as to how to remember the lost generation all too often had disturbing personal, communal, and political repercussions. Now let me try to come to a conclusion if I can. In a host of ways, these varied cultural forms carried messages about mourning which were highly traditional in character. Why was this so? And some clues may be found in an interpretive framework developed by the critical theorist Julia Kristeva, who's Bulgarian in origin. Using a vocabulary derived from psychoanalysis, she explored the power of what I term traditional structures of thought to express the anguish and hope of men and women in mourning. Among those brought up in the Catholic or Orthodox traditions, icons and images form part of what may be termed forms of aesthetic redemption. That is Hegel's phrase. I think we can all understand Kristeva's suggestion that religious discourse, alongside aesthetic and particularly literary creation, sets forth a device whose economy, interaction of characters, and implicit symbolism constitute a very faithful semiological representation of the subject's battle with symbolic collapse. I want to dwell on that phrase, symbolic collapse, because when you lose someone, the idea of the world going on is in question. But in the First World War, half of those who died had no known graves. There was no body to mourn, quite literally. War, which is always a killing machine, turned into a vanishing act. And this happened everywhere because of artillery, the great modern instrument, the great modernist instrument destruction that is being used perhaps at this very moment, not very far away on the battlefields in Ukraine. Symbolic collapse was a reality in the early Second Republic of Poland because Polish men died in 3 armies, 3 entirely different armies, and not for their country, or if you will, for their country within an imperial structure, as in the Austrian Empire. Art and ceremony, in my view, helped shore up these symbols of meaning through which grief was expressed and bereavement experienced. I think we can see relatively easily how it was not only individuals, but also symbols that had to be resurrected during and after the war. Through their elaboration, expression, and revival, these symbols were shared by millions in mourning, and what I have called traditional languages of loss in the visual arts, in prose, poetry, and inscribed in social forms of mourning contributed to the processes of healing, perhaps more through catharsis than elaboration. Now, to approach the cultural history of modernism from this angle, namely that the old has a new burst of life as much as the new, I think has other merits. It discloses fully the European character of the violence of the war decade. This is a story with fewer national boundaries than is to be found in most histories of the period. To bring these diverse cultures together in the aftermath of that war is to place less emphasis than others do on the facts of victory and defeat. They mattered, of course they mattered, but all too often, victory came in a very bitter form. It could not be otherwise in a war in which more than 10 million men died and in which half of those bodies had vanished. Privileging this facet of the war helps cast further doubt on the outmoded idea that one country suffered more from the war than others. Germany, for instance, which had a Sonderweg or a special path. I don't believe that. If there was a special path, it was the path of collective slaughter through which the world went together. There's a common history here in another way, too. The weight of evidence presented supports the view that we must eliminate once and for all the tendency surgically to bifurcate cultural history into elite sections and popular sections, into 2 registers, high and low, cultivated and uncultivated, elevated and vulgar, elevating and cliched, like some members of the Frankfurt School. Of course, there are such forms and distinctions. The Great War made a pure distinction between high and low much more difficult to uphold, and so did the modernist movement that followed it. Now, continuities proliferated in this area, but in one respect, important respect, the cultural history of the period of the Second Republic, of the Great War and its aftermath was unique. The process of breathing life into the symbols, into the symbolic language of traditional reference, so visible after 1914 and after 1918, did not happen after 1945. In effect, the search for meaning after the First World War was hard enough, but after Auschwitz and Hiroshima, the search for meaning in traditional language was infinitely more difficult. And I think this notion is part of what Adorno meant when he made his now celebrated pronouncement that to write lyric poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. He went on to add, by the way, and that's almost never cited, that literature must resist this verdict. Herein lies the paradox, not only of poetry, but of modernism itself. The abundance of real suffering tolerates no forgetting. This suffering, in Hegel's terms, this consciousness of adversity, demands the continued existence of art while it prohibits it. It is now virtually in art alone that suffering can still find its own voice, consolation, without immediately being betrayed by it. In effect, after 1945, poetry is an act of defiance, a quixotic refusal to descend into silence, and then to accept that silence is necessary. After the Second World War, the same flaring up of traditional languages appropriate to a period of mass mourning, and of course that was true after the Second World War, did not take place. There was a profusion of apocalyptic images after 1945. A few echoes are heard, but the rest is silence. Other voices emerged, other cultural forms appeared. Many of them within the modernist movement were abstract, and thereby more liberated from specific cultural reference and less accessible to a mass audience. Whether or not these abstract images have the same power to heal as did other symbolic forms is a difficult question, but my answer is maybe not. Now, I think what I'd like to do in conclusion is to say, in this powerful exhibition in the National Museum of Krakow, we can find evidence of many features of this dialectical history of modernism in the interwar years. What I can offer, though, is simply a tour d'horizon of those elements of the exhibition that illustrate the dialectical interpretation I'm offering you today. The English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins wrote of pied beauty, the glories of the world around us as proof of the existence of God. I think my interpretation moves away from his 19th century outlook. I see modernism as a movement sufficiently broad to accommodate both those who desacralized the world and those who re-sacralized it by taking old forms and tropes and wresting them to new uses. Both the desacralizers and the resacralizers lived in what the modernist poet par excellence, T.S. Eliot, called a wasteland. Ezra Pound, another modernist poet, put it this way in his poem, Hugh Selwyn Moberly. Those who survived the Great War came home to a ruined world. Here's his phrase. An old bitch gone in the teeth, a botched civilization. They had walked eye deep in hell, believing in old men's lies, then unbelieving they came home to a lie, home to many deceits, home to old lies and new infamy. The new world of the 1920s and 30s never scraped off from its hands and feet the mud and gore of the trenches and of the post-war slaughter that followed it. This is not to say that modernism was only about the past. So my interpretation is a variant of the position devoted by Piotr Juszkiewicz in Chapter 2 of the exhibition catalog, which I really recommend to everyone as the most sophisticated statement about modernism I've ever read. In his article entitled Utopia of Agency, he presents this picture. Is the self-portrait of Stanislav Witlewicz. Do forgive me for my crimes against the Polish language. Who adopted the name, is that right, Witkasi, in order to separate it from his father, if I heard correctly. This was painted in 1938 as an example of the past and the future, the traditional in the modern. As we can see the reference to Dürer's 1498 self-portrait. Look at the parallel between the two. The parallel between Dürer in 1498 and the self-portrait of 1938 is really astonishing. What the artist did was to wrest to new uses an older and celebrated convention, and of course put a different landscape, not a rural one, but an industrial one. This, in my view, is exactly the dialectic I was referring to. Dürer is alive and well in a modernist world. This is the persistence of tradition. Juszkiewicz takes as a framework for modernist ideas these themes: the sudden rejection of history and tradition, a strong belief in the potential of modern machines, technology, and production procedures, a frequently utopian aspiration for the creation of a new world, a penchant for abstraction and basic forms at the expense of ornament and decoration, and finally a tendency to combine artistic activity with political ideas and political practice of the European left. He sees modernist art as an expression of a belief that the old world was falling down, and I agree entirely. This is as pithy a statement as one could ask for. But I think what I'd like to do today is to simply supplement it by returning to that most modern of catastrophes, the Great War and its aftermath, to find the impulse behind a great deal of artistic production and reflection on modern art. I return once again to Benjamin and his insight that the men who came back from the Great War were rendered mute by the sheer violence of the modern. Millions of such bodies vanished in the Great War, leaving men and women without even the remains of their loved ones around which to organize ceremonies of separation and bereavement. Now let me try once again to persuade you that modernism is such a rich and powerful area of research that we need to look at these mixtures of the old and the new to see the work that modernism did. Let's take a look at this one. This is an extraordinary image of dance. Is, I believe, 1921, is that correct? I believe that is the year of the work of Skosilas, is that as close as I'm ever going to get to Polish, created a series of woodcuts that draw, I think, on not only traditions of folklore, but echo the work of Katie Kollwitz and some of Kandinsky's experiments in mixing abstract folklore and the decorative arts. Have a look at this one. This is Carol Hiller's Angel of 1920, just about at the time that Paul Klee created his own, and compare it to Klee's Angel of History. Hiller had an intense interest in Byzantine icons and studied at the Ukrainian Academy of Arts in Kiev, or Kiev. Like Andrei Rublev, Hiller produced images self-consciously taken from a religious archive at a time of convulsive political violence, reaching catastrophic levels in Ukraine in 1919 to 21. Helena Shramovna, a native of Lviv in Ukraine, shared Hiller's interest in Byzantine art as well as the sensitivity of Skosilas to folk art traditions. Next, I would like to draw your attention to Jan Szepkowski's pine wood sculpture entitled, by the artist, Christmas. Again, I hope I got the title correct. This was something that I wanted to make sure about. And when we went through the exhibition this morning, I was happy to see I didn't make too many errors. It was a central part of the Christmas shrine exhibited at the 1925 Paris Expo of the Decorative Arts and Modern Industry. The shrine won the grand prize of the exhibition. Once again, folk art brought out older national traditions of configuring the sacred in modern forms. The traditional and the modernist are married here. In this image, we can see Cubism confronting the sacred. Mikhailo Boychuk had a wide circle of students and admirers, despite or maybe because of the hostility of the KGB, the Cheka initially and then the KGB, to this Ukrainian artist. He is perhaps the best exemplar of the marriage of modernism and religious art, an artistic alloy that carried messages of national identity at a time when they could cost artists their lives. Boychuk was shot in Kiev in 1937. Zofia Stryjenska's color plate entitled Magie Slav, Slav Magic, pasted on cardboard, approached folk art from another direction. Once more, it was selected to represent Poland, this time as part of the 1937 exhibition on the arts and techniques of modern life. It was the occasion, this exhibition of 1937, of Pablo Picasso's Guernica, which in itself captures the modernists' dilemma about the paradox of modernity. You should remember in the middle of the Guernica, there's a light bulb. This was an exhibition celebrating electricity, electrification. And what Picasso showed is that electricity made aerial warfare possible. It wasn't only creative, it was the destructive urge within the modernist project that he confronted. We turn to Jaroslaw Jakubowski's woodcut entitled Grave Monuments, produced in 1923. I believe this was a Krakow-based artist, is that correct? I think it was. Who helped open to the Polish public what he termed the ancient world of Proto-Slavic architecture, primitively carved with a rich variety of ornaments, hidden in the dark depths of forests and boundless woods. Among religious sculptors and artists who flourished in interwar years was Jedrzej Wawro. He claimed to talk to our Lord when he sculpted, or he believed he talked to our Lord when he sculpted, and left behind many devotional works dedicated to the patron of, is it Beshkid? Is that the pronunciation? I don't know. This woodcut brings to mind some of Rouault's power and Matisse's iconography. Now, this pensive Christ is really quite extraordinary in many respects. I don't have a date for it, I'm sorry to say. Jan Raszka's Perun is part of a corpus of work marked by traditional references to but in a geometrical style. This god, rendered in wood with elements of Polish costume, was said to control storms and war. The sculptor won a prize at the 1927 Expo of the Society for the Encouragement of Fine Arts in Warsaw. right, this rich collection of modernist art, very rich collection presented in the exhibition in the National Museum, cannot be characterized in only one way. That would be unfair. Modernism was an engagement with the modern, but without a single core foundational moment. My interpretation is intended to be both celebratory. There are only 2 days left. If you haven't seen the exhibition, you really should hurry to do so, and challenging. Modernism was iconoclastic, but not iconophobic. Imagery is at its core, but its sense of the visual does not move only towards the abstract. The figurative, the decorative, the beautiful are there too. So I want to urge you to see modernism as by definition plural, contradictory, filled with conflict. That is what gives it its beauty, its dynamism. The apocalyptic landscape of Paul Klee's Angel of History was moving into an uncertain future, one over which the angel, had no control. He was so buffeted by violent forces he couldn't even close his wings. All he could do was witness. That is why I like to see the artists in the Krakow exhibition on modernism in the Second Polish Republic, not as angelic, but rather as witnesses to the turbulent and exciting times through which they lived, and to the struggle every man and woman alive at that time faced to survive it. Thank you very much.
Professor Winter, thank you very much for this brilliant lecture. Szanowni Państwo, to jest dobry moment na to, żeby zadać pytanie panu profesorowi, wejść w dyskusję, być może się z czymś nie zgodzić. Czy ktoś z Państwa chciałby zabrać głos? Bardzo proszę. Bardzo proszę, mimo że się znamy, bardzo proszę przedstawić się to będzie potem potrzebne do tłumaczenia.
My name is Sławomir Kaprelski. Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. And also I must say that your book, Memory Sites of Mourning, was very influential in my own research on some traditional communities who continue to exist in the past. My question is about the concept of tradition that you use. I think it's a very general concept. I wonder whether this is the tradition as it really was, to use Ranke's term, which had an impact on the present, or is it perhaps an invented tradition in the meaning given to this term by Hobsbawm and Ranger, tradition that is a product of modernism? Maybe, it's my modest suggestion, the past, the tradition that modernism is facing, is a tradition produced by modernism. Thank you.
Well, I would be the last person to of course. Does this help? Okay, good. I'd be the last person to suggest that the Roman Catholic Church was invented by modernism. It would be dangerous to do so not only in Poland but anywhere else. But I want to suggest that the churches had a very difficult problem in that during and immediately after the war, they didn't have the means to handle the problem of mass death. Indeed, many of the problems of mourning for those who have nobody at all to mourn was one that challenged all of the conventional churches. It wasn't a simple matter. And by the way, it remains to this day not a simple matter. In 9/11, when the Twin Towers were destroyed, when 3,000 people were killed in a terrorist attack, half of those who were killed have no known remains. It's the same, literally proportion as in the First World War. And when the bishop of the New York area, I think became a cardinal thereafter, said, our church has no language to use to account for this event. We are speechless. We are silent. That's the first point that I'd make, that there is a theological problem in modern war. We talked about it also this morning when we went to Kazimierz and had a look at some of the monuments to the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a challenge to Jewish theology. And indeed, what language can you use? The word that was used in a number of the different monuments was martyr. That's old, and it's not an invented tradition. It's a very deep tradition. The problem is it doesn't apply to 1,500,000 children who had no choice. Martyrs are people who have choice. And the choice they have is to suffer death for their faith, for their belief. But can a baby murdered by the Nazis be said to be a martyr? To have suffered for such a belief? Or, what shall we say, those Polish Jews who had no interest in retaining a belief in the religion or in the practices. And there were thousands of those that were murdered as well. What does the old language do? And I would like to suggest that there is a theological problem that is at the heart of, my inquiry, that has no solution to it. It's not that the traditional, like the word martyr, appears. I'm not surprised at that, because there is no other language. There's nothing that could apply to 1 million Jewish children in the Holocaust. I don't have any words, but the word modern doesn't work, and yet what else could they do? I think that would be my point. It's not that modernism created the language, it's that the religious language was impoverished by mass death in the 20th century, and yet there was no other language that they could use to explore the phenomenon. It's a very important question you ask, and I'm glad you did. But I don't pretend to have an answer to it.
Thank you very much. Kto z Państwa? So I have one question to you, or I would like to ask you for a comment, because you told that the states have the states no remember. Yes. There are only human who remember, but the states plays a very big, very important role in the process of remembering, because, for example, of founding of some processes or some events, our exhibitions wouldn't be possible without founding from the state. Our meeting today wouldn't be possible without the founding of some states. Could you comment this contradictory?
Yes, indeed. This is a very important matter, and I want to use the image of myself right now as part of it. States decide who gets to the microphone, but they don't decide who remembers. And who has the, as it were, capacity or the possibility of expressing thoughts is made possible by power. I'm sure that's true. But I don't feel that the process of remembrance that is state-bounded, and indeed there are many studies of what might be described in Halbach's terms as collective remembrance dealing with states and their rituals and their projects, makes enough room for the bottom of this pyramid of remembrance, below the state, below civil society, into the history of families. And I think the whole idea of collective remembrance was never about the state. Halbach, who invented the term in 1925, said that collective memory is the memory of collectives, small groups of people who do the work of remembrance. That's what he said. He never meant that there was such a thing called French collective memory or Polish collective memory. They were groups. And he based this on an assumption. All of us know our names because someone in our family had told us what our name is. We know who we are because of the group in which we live and grow up. And when that group changes, according to Halbach, so does memory. Memory is sociologically determined. It's a Durkheimian position. It's a sociological position. So the difficulty is trying to work out what does memory look if you take the view that states do it. And I think I'll give you a good example of this. It's from Solzhenitsyn. I think I can't remember which of his novels it's from. It's a story of someone who came from Moscow to talk to a factory. After work, everybody tired from work came because they had to. And at the end of his remark about whatever 5-year plan had just been realized, everyone stood up and gave him thunderous applause, the speaker. And they kept on applauding, and they kept on applauding, until somebody found that his hands were too red to keep on applauding. And he stopped, and then so did everybody else. Next morning, the first person who stopped applauding was arrested and sent to the Gulag. That gave the state the power to put boundaries around memory, and the people who were there, including Solzhenitsyn, never forgot it. I don't deny that. This is something I think we all know. The question is, are there other groups in which remembrance takes place that are out of the reach of the state, in which individuals can talk to each other? And here again, I choose a Russian example. Anna Akhmatova was one of the greatest poets in Russia, and she would whisper, because she knew there was a KGB man in the floor above her flat in St. Petersburg. She would either whisper or write and then have her friend remember the poems and then burn the piece of paper on which the poetry would be there. She actually succeeded in defying state memory. She did it. And it took a huge amount of work and loyalty on the part of her friends. How do we bridge the gap between the two, between the KGB and Anna Akhmatova? And I think it is by recognizing that the state is only in a metaphorical sense an agent of remembrance. It is one of them. But if we allow the state to be the major actor in the story of remembrance, then we leave Anna Akhmatova out of it. And that I would prefer not to do.
That's true. I gave you only positive examples of being active of the state, but there is also possible to misuse history. And that is exactly what we can observe from in Russia, not only since 21st of February, but it started much long before that moment. Proszę Państwa, czy ktoś chciałby coś skomentować, zapytać? Bardzo proszę.
Good evening. My name is Julia. I am from Ukraine, and I have one question. And I am writing about museums. These museums, Russian soldiers bombed, and I am writing about these museums. And I have questions. What do you think about Ukrainian culture after end war? Because it's a difficult situation for us. Thank you. It's even very interesting for me.
I wouldn't. Thank you for the question. I think it's an important question because there will be a moment, hopefully sooner rather than later, where we will have to talk about the memory of the war. There's exactly that. And who gets to construct it? Who gets to put the story together for people not yet born? And I think one of the things that the exhibition in the National Museum shows is objects tell stories. Objects, small things sometimes that don't matter much. The one I particularly liked, since I helped design a museum of the First World War myself, is the rabbit's foot, the superstitious objects that people carry with them for good luck. The little things that are part of the, what would you call it, the personal elements of individuality. Those armies are mass institutions preserving the fact that you are you and no one else, and that you have your own in particular memories of earlier life. Probably means that if you were a soldier today, and you could be, you would be probably with something from home that you took with you. It is to preserve those objects that I think are one of the most important tasks of memory. And again, this is an interesting part of the exhibition on modernism. There are 500 different exhibitions of objects and objects made for use or that involve daily life as well as future life. And I think this is something very important, that what museums do is tell stories through objects. Much more, I think, than words. I remember doing all of the captions. I was very happy to see that the captions in the National Museum were only in 2 languages. And the one that, on the First World War that I put together had 3. It had to be English, French, and German. These captions are difficult, but the objects are what matter. And the second thing that I think probably is embedded in the story of modernism as much as it is in museums is film. I found that my students, since I only retired a couple of years ago, are totally visually sophisticated in comparison to my generation. Film is very important in capturing literally the movement of daily life. Not just objects, but objects in time and space are what films can capture. I think the third thing that I found, and I don't know if it will work, but that the language that soldiers use to each other is not the language of heroic patriotism, even though they may feel it, and in fact probably do, otherwise they wouldn't be there. But the language of soldiers is very varied. Some of it is unprintable. Some of it is heroic, and some of it is religious. But I think to catch the voices of those who are on the front line is a really very important issue. So your question is not premature. I think it's vital to preserve the record of courage and fortitude that is being shown, I think, to this day, and to make sure that those objects become part of the, as it were, of the national archive of Ukraine. I'm sure that this is something that other people might have better ideas about, since I don't know the precise, as it were, kit that a soldier would be carrying. But in all other contexts that I know about, make sure that the human paraphernalia of survival, literally what you take with you. It's what one man in the Vietnam War said: preserve the things they carried. That's Tim O'Brien's way of giving an answer to your question. Make sure that they stay alive.
Bardzo proszę.
Hello again. Thanks for the insightful lecture. I think it gives us a lot of food for thought. I'm originally from Hong Kong, but in the past 12 years, I've been in and out of the UK. I've studied and worked there. I was forced to head back to Hong Kong back in 2016, and I was involved actively in the Solidarity movement back in 2019. So now I'm back here again. Well, I've visited Poland before, so I'm back here again as a student reading for a master's in international security and development. So sorry for that, but I digress. And it's just, well, we mentioned a lot about like these modernity principles, and the way we're looking at them is like how we're seeing like progress, like we're trying to like modernize in a way. And unfortunately, I think like we're not really learning a lot from history, and we're repeating the same mistakes quite a lot. And I'm just trying to figure out like, how should we actually deal with this like really linear causal way of thinking about things, and like in the contemporary world, how could we prevent these modernist principles, ideas to be like abused, distorted for like malicious intent? Yeah.
Well,
very much.
the question I think should probably be embedded in your course, because look at it this way. I pointed out that Hannah Arendt, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, both pointed to the fact that you only have the right to have rights if you are a citizen of a nation. But at the same time, national sovereignty is a limit on international law. The International Criminal Court has framed an indictment of Putin for war crimes, probably genocide as well. It's coming, it's developing. And yet international Criminal Court is not recognized by many countries in the world because national sovereignty matters more than international law. There's a contradiction for you to think about. You ask, how can modernity be perhaps protected from itself, which is a kind of argument consistent with what I tried to say earlier. And I think it is through the development of human rights. But human rights are transnational, they're international. And if a state like Poland doesn't like what an international court like the European Court of Human Rights decides, the state of Poland will simply reject the decision. And I think this is a real, a living problem right now, that the human rights experiment is just beginning. It hasn't been going all that long. It started roughly in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then moved into the construction of the European Union, the European Court of Human Rights, then the UN set up an International Criminal Court. These are early days in the life of human rights. That's an answer. The answer is by putting state sovereignty below a higher principle, which is called the law of human rights. But my guess, I will stand corrected, is that you wouldn't get a majority of the Polish population behind such an idea. I don't think you'd get a population of the British public behind such an idea. Well, they left the European Union for a number of reasons. One of them was this, I think, that the British Parliament should be sovereign and nothing should be higher than it. I mean that. What about punishing, a country, because, Russia is in the Council of Europe. It's part of the European experiment, if you will. It's not part of the European Union, but it was one of the Soviet Union initially, and then later Russia, but one part of the constellation of European rights. And the Soviet Union voted for the Universal Declaration in 1948. So I think you should perhaps see if your course, was it called Security and Development, has a component on the contradictions and difficulties inherent in squaring national sovereignty with international human rights law. It's something that one of the most interesting commentators on all of these problems, a man named Philippe Sands, has written a lot about it, and I'm sure there are quite a few others who've written about it too. But if you take away from this lecture that there is a series of contradictions that make it difficult for modernity to police itself, then I'll be satisfied that I've done my job.
Powoli kończy się czas przeznaczony na dzisiejsze spotkanie. Jeśli ktoś z Państwa jeszcze chce zadać pytanie, to będzie ostatnie. Pan profesor Piotr Juszkiewicz.
Thank you. It's not so much a question, but rather a request, because you said that modernism doesn't heal. And I agree absolutely, but the paradox is that all modernists dreamt about healing the world, of regenerating the whole population and the world as such. And my request is, can I borrow your expression as the title of my next book?
Absolutely. You can not only borrow it, you can have full property to it. The purpose of these events is sharing what we all know to be the endless, I think, excitement about the modernist project.
Sure.
So I'm very pleased. Indeed, it would be an honor after the really quite extraordinary exhibition that you curated and the catalog that you produced on it. May I congratulate you on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
That is exactly why we organize such meetings. Thank you very much. Professor Winter, thank you for coming to Poland. Thank you for coming to Krakow and to be with us. I discovered very good information for you, for all of us, that Professor Winter is going to come back to Krakow at the beginning of June, being invited to the conference organized at the Krakow University, Jagiellonian University. Szanowni Państwo, bardzo dziękuję, że Państwo zechcieli ten czas spędzić z nami. Bardzo dziękuję za pytania, za dyskusję. Panu profesorowi Juszkiewiczowi, panu profesorowi Szczerskiemu, nieobecny już w tej chwili, bo pojechała odbierać nagrodę do Warszawy. Przyznaję, że nie pamiętam jaką, ale ważną nagrodę dla Międzynarodowego Centrum Kultury, pani dyrektor Agacie Wąsowskiej-Pawlik. Życzę Państwu dobrego wieczoru i dobrego weekendu. Dziękuję bardzo.